Alright, so we need to talk about probably the most hated faction in all of Elder Scrolls lore. Yeah, I'm talking about the Thalmor, those elven supremacists, who seem to exist solely to make everyone's life miserable in Skyrim. But here's the thing that's going to make some of you really uncomfortable. What if they actually had a point? What if, when you strip away all the propaganda and look at their actual motivations and beliefs, the Thalmor weren't just cartoon villains, but actually had legitimate grievances and maybe even a cosmically valid argument for everything they've done? Well, we will see. We're going to go deep into Thalmor lore today, and I mean really deep. We're talking about their entire history from the very beginning, their theological beliefs, their rise to power, the Great War, and all the theories about what they're really trying to accomplish. And somewhere in all of that, we're going to explore the uncomfortable possibility that from their perspective, they might actually be the good guys. Or at least, that their actions make a twisted sort of sense when you understand where they're coming from. Also, a shout out to Christopher Lee for sending in today's gameplay. If you also want to send in gameplay, you can use the form in the description. So let's start at the very beginning, because to understand the Thalmor, you need to understand Altmer creation mythology and why they believe what they believe. Imagine this: before time even existed, before the mortal world, before anything we'd recognize as reality, there were spirits, the Etada, or Aedra as the elves call them. These weren't just powerful beings, they were essentially pure divine essence, immortal, unlimited, existing in a realm called Aetherius, where they just kind of floated around in timeless, formless bliss. According to Altmer belief, they are the direct descendants of these original spirits, not metaphorically, literally. The High Elves genuinely believed that their ancestors were gods, and that they retained fragments of that original divinity in their blood. That's where their longer lifespans come from, their natural affinity for magic, their whole deal. They see themselves as fallen gods, trying to remember what they once were. Now here's where things get interesting. There was this spirit called Lorcan, known by a bunch of different names depending on which culture you ask. Shor to the Nords, Shezar to the Imperials, Sep to the Red Guards. To the Altmer, he's the Doom Drum, the trickster god, the cosmic villain of their entire mythology. And what did Lorcan do that was so terrible? He convinced the other spirits to create Mundus, the mortal world. He sold them this vision of a new realm where they could create something amazing, where their aspects could exist and interact in ways that weren't possible in Aetherius. He told Auriel, the chief of the Aedric spirits who would later become known as Akatosh, that he'd become the king of this new world. The pitch worked. A bunch of these divine spirits agreed to the project. But it was a lie. Or at least, Lorcan didn't tell them the full cost. Creating Mundus required these spirits to give up their divine essence. They had to sacrifice their immortality, their unlimited power, their very nature as gods. The creation of the mortal plane was essentially a trap that forced divine beings to become mortal, or at least greatly diminished. Some of them straight up died. Others, like Magnus, who designed the whole thing, bailed at the last second when they realized what was happening. Tearing holes in reality as they fled back to Aetherius, those holes became the sun and stars. The spirits who stayed had to physically incarnate, had to reproduce sexually just to continue existing, and with each generation they got weaker. Their children retained less of that original divine spark. Eventually, after countless generations, you get the Aldmer, the first elves, and even they were way more powerful than what came after. By the time we get to the First Era, Second Era, and beyond, the Altmer are just a shadow of what their divine ancestors once were. From the Altmer perspective, this is the original sin of the universe. Lorcan didn't create the world as a gift. He created a prison. He trapped divine beings in mortal flesh, subjected them to death and suffering and limitation. He stole their immortality and left them stuck in this degraded physical existence. And here's the kicker. The Altmer remember this. It's not ancient history to them. It's a wound that's still bleeding. Their entire culture is built around this cosmic trauma. So when you hear Thalmor agents talking about restoring things to how they should be, this is what they mean. They're not just being pompous when they claim superiority over humans. From their worldview, they're literally descended from gods, while humans are descended from the weakest spirits, the ones Lorcan deliberately created to be his tools. It's not racism in their eyes, it's cosmic hierarchy written into the fabric of reality itself. And this belief, this cosmic grievance about being trapped in mortality, is what drives everything that comes after. It's the wound that never heals, the justification that underlies every action the Thalmor take. Because if you genuinely believe you were robbed of divinity, then reclaiming it becomes not just a goal, but a sacred duty. That's why we need to look at how this ideology played out historically, how these beliefs translated into actual political movements. Now let's fast forward to the Second Era, because the Thalmor didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The organization has roots that go way back, and understanding those early iterations helps explain what they eventually became. The first Aldmeri Dominion was formed in the year 580 of the Second Era during a period called the Interregnum. There was no emperor, the entire continent was in chaos, and three unlikely allies came together: the High Elves of Somerset, the Wood Elves of Valenwood, and the Kajit of Elsewhere. The leader who made this happen was Queen Aeren, an Altmer who was actually pretty forward-thinking for her time. Here's where the Thalmor first appear in history. Back then, they were essentially bureaucrats and cops. The Thalmor served as the administrative arm of the Dominion, managing day-to-day affairs, enforcing Dominion law, and acting as a liaison between the different races and factions. They were the people who made the Alliance actually function on a practical level. They also served as the Dominion's military police. But even then, even under the relatively progressive rule of Queen Aeren, there were cracks in the facade. Some Altmer dissidents questioned the Thalmor's policies, accusing them of sending generations of young Altmer to die in pointless wars. The seeds of extremism were already there, buried under layers of bureaucratic procedure. The First Dominion eventually fell apart after Queen Aeren's time, losing to Tiber Septim's empire in the late Second Era. That defeat was crushing for the Altmer. Tiber Septim, a human warlord, conquered their supposedly superior civilization. And he didn't do it through fair combat or superior tactics alone. He used the Numidium, a giant Dwemer god robot that could literally alter reality. This walking doomsday weapon forced the proud Altmer to their knees and incorporated them into his empire. The humiliation of this defeat cannot be overstated. For the Altmer, it confirmed their worst fears, that the world created by Lorcan favored chaos and change over order and tradition, that human ambition and recklessness could defeat elven wisdom and skill. The shame festered for generations. Then came the Second Aldmeri Dominion in the year 830 of the Second Era. Valenwood was in civil war, different factions fighting over who should rule. The Altmer saw an opportunity. They claimed they had an ancient treaty that gave them authority to establish a government in Valenwood on behalf of a claimant named Cameron Anaximes. So they invaded, conquered the province, and set up a provisional government that they called, you guessed it, the Thalmor. This version of the Thalmor was much more aggressive than the first. They weren't just administrators anymore, they were a foreign occupying government. Their stated goal was to protect Valenwood and bring order to the region, but the reality was more cynical. The Altmer wanted control over Valenwood because pirates operating from Valenwood and southern Hammerfell had been threatening Somerset for years. The Thalmor was a tool of Altmer imperial expansion, wrapped in a veneer of legitimate authority. During this period, the Thalmor started developing some of their more problematic ideologies. They began explicitly articulating beliefs about Altmer superiority over other races. The Bosmer and other non-Altmer were seen as lesser, useful allies, but definitely not equals. The foundations of racial supremacist thinking were being laid. The Second Dominion was eventually defeated by Tiber Septim II, using that same Numidium. Another humiliating loss to human ambition and Dwemer technology. The Thalmor faded into the background once again, but they didn't disappear. They were learning, adapting, waiting for their next opportunity. And here's the crucial part. These repeated defeats didn't make the Thalmor moderate or give up. They radicalized them. Each loss to human empires reinforced their core belief that Lorkhan's world was fundamentally unjust, that brute force and technological terror could overcome divine right. The humiliation festered and metastasized into something darker. When they finally got another chance at power, they wouldn't make the same mistakes. They wouldn't be reasonable or progressive like Queen Erin's dominion. This time, they'd be ruthless. For most of the Third Era, the Thalmor existed as what most Altmer considered a fringe extremist group. They were the loudmouthed conspiracy theorists of Somerset society, the ones who wouldn't shut up about Altmer's superiority and how the Empire was oppressing them. Most regular Altmer ignored or actively mocked them. They led boycotts of imperial goods, they worshipped Daedra, they were generally seen as embarrassing cranks that nobody took seriously. But they were organizing. They were developing their ideology, refining their message, building networks, and recruiting new members. They were essentially playing the long game, waiting for a crisis they could exploit. Then came the Oblivion crisis at the end of the Third Era, year 433, and suddenly the Thalmor's moment arrived. When Emperor Uriel Septim and all his legitimate heirs were assassinated and Myrun's Dagon's forces invaded Tamriel through Oblivion gates, every province suffered, but Somerset was hit particularly hard. The Daedric hordes poured through multiple gates across the islands. Refugees trying to flee by sea were caught by magical storms that the Daedra had conjured. Thousands died on the docks and wharves as they tried to escape. The ocean itself became a death trap. The Crystal Tower, that ancient symbol of Altmer civilization and magical prowess, became the last line of defense. Altmer sorcerers and archers made their stand there, killing so many Daedra that the invaders had to climb over mountains of their own dead to reach the walls. It was a desperate, brutal fight for survival. The official story is that Martin Septim ended the Oblivion crisis when he sacrificed himself and destroyed the Amulet of Kings, manifesting as an avatar of Akatosh and stopping Mehrunes Dagon. That's what saved Cyrodiil and ended the invasions across all of Tamriel, but the Thalmor told a different story. The Thalmor claimed that they were the ones who saved Somerset. They said their deep and ancient magics were what closed the Oblivion gates in the Elven lands. They spread this narrative aggressively, and they eliminated anyone who contradicted it. There was this guy named Rinandor the Bold who questioned their version of events. The Thalmor first spread rumors to discredit him, then got him exiled, then had him assassinated on a ship bound for Anvil. Anyone else who wanted to speak up about what really happened got the message real quick. In the chaos and trauma of the Oblivion crisis, with the Empire in disarray and the Altmer population desperate for someone who seemed strong and capable, the Thalmor's propaganda worked. The same organization that had been mocked as extremists just a few years earlier were now seen as saviors. The trauma of the Oblivion crisis gave them the political capital they needed. This is the pattern we see across Tamriel's history. Extremists waiting in the wings for a crisis that discredits the mainstream. The Oblivion crisis was that moment for the Thalmor. The Empire failed to protect Somerset, the traditional monarchy seemed weak and unprepared, and suddenly those crazy extremists who'd been shouting about Altmer's self-reliance and superiority didn't seem so crazy anymore. Crisis creates opportunity, and the Thalmor were ready to seize it. Let's move into the Fourth Era, where the Thalmor really came into their own as a major power. After the Oblivion crisis, the Empire was a mess. Uriel Septim and the entire Septim bloodline were gone. There was no clear heir. The Elder Council was scrambling to maintain order, and High Chancellor Okato was basically holding the Empire together through sheer force of will as potentate. Then, in the year 4, Era 10, Okato was assassinated. The Thalmor are widely suspected of being behind the murder. The guy who was keeping the Empire from collapsing was suddenly gone, and the Thalmor had the most to gain. This sparked a civil war called the Stormcrown Interregnum that lasted 7 years. Different factions all claimed they should be the next emperor. The empire was tearing itself apart from within. Eventually, a Colovian warlord named Titus Mede seized the throne in year 17 of the Fourth Era, but by then the damage was done. The empire was weak, divided, and unable to project power like it once could. While the empire was busy with its succession crisis, the Thalmor made their move. In year 22 of the Fourth Era, they overthrew the traditional Altmer monarchy in a violent coup. They seized complete control of Somerset, renaming it Alenor after the ancient capital. But they didn't stop with just taking power. They purged anyone they considered impure or disloyal. This is where things get really dark. The Thalmor implemented what can only be called ethnic cleansing programs. Anyone who wasn't of the blood of the Altmer was killed. Mixed race individuals, political dissidents, anyone who had supported the old government or questioned Thalmor authority, they were all eliminated in pogroms that swept across the islands. The Thalmor established a totalitarian state where opposition meant death. But some Altmer managed to flee. Refugees who opposed the Thalmor escaped to other provinces, particularly Hammerfell. They settled in places like Sentinel, trying to build new lives away from Thalmor control. The Thalmor hunted them down anyway. In the year 42 of the Fourth Era, something called the Night of Green Fire occurred. Thalmor mages attacked the Altmer refugee quarter in Sentinel. By the time Imperial legionnaires stationed in the city could respond, the entire refugee district was nothing but a smoking crater. Everyone who lived there was dead. The Thalmor had used their most destructive battle magic on their own people, just to make sure no dissidents remained alive. This wasn't isolated. The Thalmor conducted similar attacks on Altmer refugees in other locations. They made it clear that leaving wasn't an option, that opposing them wasn't an option, that anything less than total loyalty meant death. They were establishing a regime based on fear and absolute control. In year 29 of the Fourth Era, Thalmor sympathizers in Valenwood launched a coup and overthrew the imperial administration there. Valenwood joined with Somerset to form the Third Aldmeri Dominion. The Dominion then severed all contact with the Empire, closed its borders, and began consolidating its power in complete isolation. This wasn't random timing. The Thalmor had spent 7 years purging internal opposition and building a totalitarian state in Somerset. Only once they had absolute control at home, once they'd eliminated anyone who might question or resist, did they turn their attention outward. The ethnic cleansing and terror weren't just about ideology. They were about creating a unified, fanatical power base that could support imperial expansion. You can't conquer neighbors when you're dealing with dissent at home. The Thalmor understood this, which is why the violence in Somerset directly enabled the expansion into Valenwood. Now we need to talk about one of the most mysterious and possibly sinister things the Thalmor did, the Void Knights. In year 98 of the Fourth Era, both of Nirn's moons just vanished. Maser and Secunda, gone from the sky for 2 full years. This affected everyone, but for the Kajit of elsewhere, it was an existential crisis. See, Kajit biology is directly tied to the moons. Which lunar phase you're born under determines what type of Kajit you become, whether you're a massive Cathay rat or a tiny Ulfric, whether you walk on 2 legs or 4. The moons aren't just religious symbols to them, they're literally woven into their entire existence as a species. Having both moons disappear was like having the fundamental laws of reality break. Nobody knows for sure what caused the Void Knights. Some theories say it was a natural astronomical event. Others point fingers directly at the Thalmor, suggesting they had the power to make the moons vanish. There's speculation in some out-of-game lore discussions that the Thalmor may have done it deliberately to affect Kajit reproduction. What we do know is that no new Kajit were being born during those 2 years. The absence of the moons essentially sterilized the entire race temporarily. When the moons returned in year 100 of the Fourth Era, the Thalmor immediately took credit. They claimed they had used ancient dawn magics to restore Maser and Secunda to the sky. They positioned themselves as the saviors of the entire Kajit race. Did they actually do it? There's zero proof either way, but it didn't matter whether it was true, the Kajit believed them. The Empire's influence in elsewhere had been declining for years. The Mane, the spiritual and political leader of the Kajit, had been assassinated sometime before year 40 of the Fourth Era, throwing southern elsewhere into chaos. The region was unstable and desperate. When the Thalmor claimed to have saved them from the Void Knights, the Kajit embraced them as heroes. A coup dissolved the Elsewhere Confederacy in year 115 of the Fourth Era. The old political structure was swept away and replaced with two kingdoms, Anaquina and Palatine, that became client states of the Third Aldmeri Dominion. Elsewhere was now essentially a vassal of the Thalmor, providing troops and resources for whatever the Dominion wanted to do next. This was information warfare at its finest. Whether the Thalmor actually had the power to manipulate the moons is almost irrelevant. What matters is that they understood how to exploit a crisis, how to control the narrative, and how to turn a mysterious catastrophe into political capital. They took credit for solving a problem and gained an entire province's loyalty as a result. And this is where the pieces start coming together. By year 171 of the Fourth Era, the Thalmor had built something the Altmer hadn't had in centuries, a true empire. They controlled Somerset absolutely through terror and ideology. They had Valenwood as a willing partner that gave them forward bases and Bosmer troops. And crucially, they had Elsewhere's gratitude and military support, including those fierce Kajit warriors who felt they owed the Thalmor everything. This three-province power base, unified under Thalmor ideology and military command, was what made the Great War possible. Without Valenwood and Elsewhere, Somerset alone couldn't have challenged the Empire, but with them, the balance of power had shifted. By year 171 of the Fourth Era, the Third Aldmeri Dominion was at the height of its power. Somerset, Valenwood, and Elsewhere were all under Thalmor control. The Empire, meanwhile, was still recovering from decades of internal strife. Emperor Titus Mede II had stabilized things somewhat, but the Empire was nowhere near as strong as it had been under the Septims. The Thalmor decided it was time to make their move. They sent an ambassador to the imperial city with a list of demands. First, the Empire had to ban all worship of Talos, the Ninth Divine. Second, the Empire had to pay a massive monetary tribute. Third, the Empire had to cede significant territories to Dominion control, particularly valuable land in Hammerfell. When Titus Mede II refused these demands, the Thalmor ambassador dumped a cart full of severed heads onto the floor. Every single Blades agent who had been stationed in Aldmeri Dominion territory, the heads of the Empire's entire spy network in the region, the Thalmor had identified and executed them all. Then the ambassador declared war. The Great War lasted from year 171 to 175 of the Fourth Era, and it was absolutely brutal. The Thalmor strategy was brilliant in its execution. Two armies attacked simultaneously. General Lady Aranelia led forces from Valenwood into western Cyrodiil, then bypassed the cities and crossed into Hammerfell. At the same time, Lord Naarfin led a huge army from hidden camps in northern Elsewhere straight into southern Cyrodiil, catching the Imperial defenders completely off guard. The Dominion forces were well prepared and well coordinated. They captured Leawin, then Bravil, then Anvil. By the end of year 172 of the Fourth Era, Lord Naarfin's forces had reached the Imperial city itself. The Imperial Navy fought to defend Lake Rumare and the Naiben, but the Dominion forces surrounded the city on three sides. In year 174 of the Fourth Era, the Aldmeri Dominion achieved what seemed impossible. They captured the Imperial city. The White Gold Tower itself fell. Thousands died in what became known as the Sack of the Imperial City. Titus Mede II barely escaped north to Skyrim with what remained of his forces. This is where the Thalmor strategy gets really interesting from a military perspective. They had the imperial capital, they had won. By any reasonable assessment, the war was over and the empire had lost. But the Thalmor weren't satisfied with just military victory, they wanted total political domination. Instead of pressing their advantage while they had it, the Dominion forces spread out to occupy their conquests and hold territory. This gave the empire time to regroup. Over the winter of year 174 into 175, Emperor Titus Mede II gathered reinforcements from Skyrim and Hammerfell. He pretended to be preparing to surrender, encouraged the Dominion in that belief, while actually planning a massive counterattack. The Battle of the Red Ring, on the 30th of Rain's Hand in year 175, is still studied by imperial strategists as a masterwork. Titus Mede II divided his forces into 3 armies. General Decianus, with legions from Hammerfell, hid in the Colovian highlands. General Jonna, with mostly Nord legions, positioned near Cheydinhal. The emperor himself led the main force in an assault from the north. The battle lasted 5 days. Decianus' forces swept down from the west, catching Lord Narifin completely by surprise. Jonna's legions drove south along the Red Ring Road, fighting through bitter Aldmeri counterattacks. By the 5th day, the Aldmeri army in the imperial city was completely surrounded. The emperor personally captured Lord Narifin. Some rumors say he wielded the legendary sword Goldbrand during the final assault. The main Aldmeri force in Cyrodiil was utterly destroyed. But here's the thing, the imperial forces were shattered too. Not a single legion had more than half its troops fit for duty. 2 legions had been completely wiped out. The empire had technically won the battle, but they had nothing left to fight with. The Dominion forces in Hammerfell were still intact. Lady Aranela's army was still operational. If the war continued, the empire would lose. So Titus Mede II signed the White Gold Concordat. The peace treaty gave the Aldmeri Dominion everything they had originally demanded: the ban on Talos worship, the disbanding of the Blades, territorial concessions in Hammerfell. The empire had won the Battle of the Red Ring, but lost the war anyway. This is the genius of Thalmor's strategy revealed. They understood that military victory isn't the same as achieving your goals. They lost the battle but won the war because they positioned things so that even defeat served their purposes. The empire was too exhausted to continue fighting, which meant the Thalmor could dictate terms from a position of weakness that looked like strength. This connects directly to what makes the concordat so brilliant as a weapon. Now here's where you have to appreciate the Thalmor's strategic thinking, even if you hate everything they stand for. The White Gold Concordat wasn't just a peace treaty, it was a weapon designed to destroy the empire from within. Think about what the Concordat accomplished. First, it banned worship of Talos, the ninth divine, the patron god of the Nords. This wasn't just about theology. Talos was a symbol of human achievement, proof that a mortal man could ascend to divinity through his deeds. For the Thalmor, that was an existential threat to their entire worldview. If humans could become gods, then what made the Altmer special? What justified their claims of superiority? But the ban also had a practical purpose. It drove a wedge between the Empire and one of its most loyal provinces. The Nords of Skyrim revered Talos above all other gods. Forcing the Empire to ban his worship was guaranteed to cause massive resentment and instability. Second, the territorial concessions in Hammerfell were deliberately chosen to be unacceptable to the Redguards. When the Empire agreed to cede that land, Hammerfell refused to go along with it and seceded from the Empire entirely. The Dominion lost that territory eventually. The Redguards fought them to a standstill and forced them to withdraw with the Second Treaty of Strozm Kai in year 180 of the Fourth Era. But that didn't matter to the Thalmor's long-term strategy. What mattered was that Hammerfell was now independent, no longer contributing its formidable warriors and resources to imperial defense. Third, the Concordat gave the Thalmor legal authority to operate throughout imperial territory to enforce the Talos ban. Thalmor justiciars could travel anywhere in the Empire arrest anyone for worshipping Talos, interrogate suspects, maintain secret prisons. The Empire had to allow an enemy intelligence and security apparatus to operate freely within its own borders. It was like if the CIA had to let KGB agents wander around America making arrests. Fourth, and most insidiously, the concordat was designed to be humiliating. The Empire had to accept terms that were identical to the demands they'd rejected at the start of the war, after 4 years of brutal fighting and hundreds of thousands of deaths. That humiliation would breed resentment, division, and questions about whether the Empire was even worth preserving. The Thalmor weren't just trying to defeat the Empire militarily, they were trying to make it collapse from internal contradictions. Every provision of the white gold concordat was calculated to weaken imperial authority, turn provinces against each other, and prevent the Empire from ever rebuilding its strength. And it worked. By year 201 of the Fourth Era, when the events of Skyrim take place, the Empire is a shell of its former self. Hammerfell is independent. Morrowind never recovered from Red Mountain's eruption. Black Marsh is controlled by the Englil. Elsewhere is a Dominion client state, and Skyrim itself is in civil war. And that civil war? That's not an accident or an unintended consequence. It's the direct result of Thalmor manipulation that was only possible because of the authority the Concordat gave them. The ban on Talos worship gave them a wedge issue, the humiliation of the treaty gave them leverage, the legal authority to operate in imperial territory gave them access. All of this came together in their most successful operation, Ulfric's Stormcloak. Speaking of Skyrim's civil war, we need to talk about Ulfric's Stormcloak and the Thalmor's most successful manipulation operation. There's a dossier you can find in the Thalmor embassy during the diplomatic immunity quest that lays out the whole ugly story. Ulfric was captured during the Great War when he was fighting for the Empire during the campaign for the White Gold Tower. He was taken to the Thalmor for interrogation, where first emissary Elenwen, the same Elenwen you meet at the embassy in Skyrim, was assigned to handle him. They tortured him and extracted information about Imperial troop movements and strategy. Here's the really insidious part. The information Ulfric gave them was actually useless. The Imperial city had already fallen before he broke under torture. But the Thalmor made Ulfric believe that his information had been crucial to the city's capture, that his weakness had led directly to the Empire's greatest defeat. They broke him psychologically, then they let him escape. After the war, the Thalmor established contact with Ulfric again. According to the dossier, he proved his worth as an asset, though it describes him as generally uncooperative to direct contact. The dossier specifically mentions that the Markarth incident was particularly valuable from the point of view of our strategic goals in Skyrim. What was the Markarth incident? After the Great War, the Forsworn had taken control of the Reach and established an independent kingdom in Markarth. The Empire asked Ulfric to retake the city in exchange for being allowed to worship Talos freely in Markarth. Ulfric and his militia did their job and recaptured the city. But then the Thalmor got involved, demanding that the Empire enforce the Talos ban. The Empire caved, arrested Ulfric, and threw him in prison to appease the Thalmor. This sequence of events perfectly illustrates how the Thalmor operate. They manipulated Ulfric's trauma and guilt from the war. They encouraged him to take actions that would destabilize the Empire. Then, when his actions gave them an excuse to push the Empire around, they used that opportunity to further humiliate Imperial authority and radicalize more Nords against the Empire. When Ulfric eventually murdered High King Torrig and started the Stormcloak Rebellion, the Thalmor were thrilled. The dossier even notes that Ulfric's death at Helgen would have been problematic for their plans. They needed him alive to keep the conflict going. His execution would have given the Empire too much of an advantage. Fortunately for the Thalmor, Alduin's attack on Helgen allowed Ulfric to escape before the execution could happen. Whether this was coincidence or something more is never confirmed, but the outcome served Thalmor interests perfectly. They need him alive to keep the conflict going. At the same time, they don't want him to actually win, because an independent Skyrim could be harder to deal with than a weakened empire. This is psychological warfare at its most effective. The Thalmor didn't need to directly control Ulfric or make him a conscious agent. They just needed to traumatize him, manipulate his circumstances, and then let his own pride and anger do the rest. He genuinely believes he's fighting for Skyrim's freedom, never realizing that his rebellion serves Thalmor interests better than anything they could have orchestrated themselves. But here's what makes this truly chilling. All of this political maneuvering, all the wars and manipulations and strategic brilliance might just be groundwork for something far worse. Because while the Thalmor are busy destabilizing the Empire and maintaining their dominance, there's evidence they're working toward a goal that makes all the political stuff look like a sideshow. The civil wars, the concordat, the whole geopolitical chess game might just be keeping everyone distracted while they pursue their real objective. Now we get into the really deep lore, the stuff that makes the Thalmor potentially an existential threat to all of reality. This is the Tower Theory, and it's one of the most fascinating and terrifying aspects of Thalmor goals. The theory originates from texts written by Michael Kirkbride, a former Elder Scrolls writer whose work isn't technically canon, but has been incredibly influential on the series. According to these texts, there are structures called towers scattered across Tamriel and Nirn. Each tower has a stone that serves as its heart and powers it. These towers aren't just buildings, they're cosmic anchors that stabilize reality itself and keep Mundus, the mortal plane, from dissolving back into chaos. The first tower was the Adamantine Tower on High Rock, also called Direni Tower or the Tower. It was supposedly where the Aedra held convention, the meeting where they judged Lorkhan after creating Mundus. The second was Red Mountain in Vardenfell, where Lorkhan's heart landed after being torn from his body. These two towers were created by the Aedra or by the act of creation itself. The other towers were built by various races trying to imitate Adamantine Tower's properties. The Altmer built the Crystal Tower in Somerset. The Eyelids built White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil. The Dwemer built Numidium. The Bosmer have Green Sap Tower in Valenwood. Snowthroat is the throat of the world in Skyrim. There are a few others mentioned in the lore. Here's where it gets scary. According to the Tower Theory, if all the towers are destroyed or deactivated, Mundus will cease to exist. Reality will unmake itself. And guess what's been happening throughout the Elder Scrolls series? Red Tower was deactivated in Morrowind when the Nerevarine destroyed the heart of Lorkhan. The mountain later erupted, destroying the tower completely. Crystal Tower was destroyed during the Oblivion crisis. White Gold Tower lost its stone when the Amulet of Kings was shattered at the end of Oblivion. Numidium was destroyed during the events of Daggerfall. Greensap Tower's status is unclear, but it's under Thalmor control in Valenwood. Snowthroat might have been damaged when Alduin was cast forward through time. Only Adamantine Tower is confirmed to still be active. Almost every other tower has been destroyed, deactivated, or compromised. And a lot of these destructions happened during times when the Thalmor were rising to power or positioning themselves strategically. Now, there's a text called the Altmeri Commentary on Talos that lays out what might be the Thalmor's true goal. It's written as an Altmeri perspective on how to achieve apotheosis, returning to godhood. The text outlines a 3-step plan. Step 1. Erase Talos from the mythic. His presence fortifies the wheel of the convention and binds Altmer's souls to the mortal plane. If they can unmake Talos as a god by eliminating his worship, they weaken one of the forces keeping reality stable. Step 2. Remove man, not just from the world but from the pattern of possibility itself. Erase humanity so completely that the very idea of humans can be forgotten and never repeated. Step 3. With Talos and humans gone, the dragon, meaning time and linear reality, will be able to unbind. The mortal world will end, and the Altmer will return to their original divine state. This is genocidal cosmic horror taken to its logical extreme. The Thalmor don't just want to rule the world, they want to destroy it and everything in it so they can ascend back to divinity. Every elf who isn't Altmer, every human, every Kajit, Argonian, everyone and everything that exists would be unmade, reality itself would cease to exist in its current form. Now, it's important to note that this interpretation is controversial in Elder Scrolls lore communities. The Altmeri commentary on Talos is an out-of-game text, not something you can find in the actual games. Some people take it as the definitive explanation of Thalmor goals. Others point out that nothing in the actual games explicitly confirms that Thalmor want to destroy the world. The novels mention that the Thalmor want to bring about a new Merethic era, which could just mean elven dominance, not literal apocalypse. There's also the question of whether all Thalmor even know about this potential endgame. It could be that the rank and file justiciars think they're just enforcing the Talos ban and maintaining elven supremacy, while only the inner leadership understands the true cosmic implications of what they're doing. It could be that some Thalmor genuinely believe they're making the world better, more orderly, more just, while being unknowingly guided toward apocalyptic goals by their leaders. The evidence for the tower theory comes from the pattern of tower destructions, the Thalmor's actions regarding Talos worship, and that Altmeri commentary text. The evidence against it is that the games themselves never explicitly state that Thalmor want to destroy the world, and attributing that goal to them might be taking Michael Kirkbride's out-of-game writings too literally. But here's the thing, even if the tower theory is completely wrong, even if the Thalmor aren't trying to unmake reality, their actual stated goals are bad enough. They want Merethic dominance, a return to a time when elves ruled over everyone else, when humans were at best servants and at worst didn't exist at all. They're willing to commit genocide, torture, ethnic cleansing, and totalitarian oppression to achieve those goals. Whether they're trying to destroy the universe or just enslave, it doesn't really change how evil their methods are. And this brings us full circle back to where we started, that creation mythology, that cosmic wound. Whether the Thalmor are trying to literally unmake Mundus or just establish elven supremacy, both goals trace back to the same source. Lorcan tricked their ancestors. Mortality is a prison. The current world order is fundamentally unjust. Everything they do, from the ethnic cleansing to the political manipulation to potentially destroying the towers, flows from that one central belief. That's why understanding their mythology isn't just academic, it's the key to understanding why they think everything they do is justified. Okay, so we've covered the history, the ideology, the strategy, and the theories. Now comes the really uncomfortable part, making the case for why the Thalmor might actually have a point. I want to be crystal clear here. This is not an endorsement of their methods or their racist ideology. What we're doing is trying to understand their perspective and see if any of their arguments have validity when stripped of the supremacist rhetoric. Let's start with the most fundamental level, their creation mythology. From the Altmer perspective, they didn't choose to be mortal. They didn't consent to being trapped in physical bodies subject to death and suffering. Their divine ancestors were tricked by Lorcan into sacrificing their immortality to create a world nobody asked for. Think about that for a second. Imagine you were once immortal, unlimited, existing in a state of timeless bliss. Then someone lies to you and tricks you into giving all that up, trapping you in a meat prison that gets old, sick, and dies. You'd be pretty pissed off too, right? From their point of view, mortality isn't a gift. It's a curse that was inflicted on them through deception. Now, humans see this completely differently. To humans, Lorcan is a hero who gave them the gift of existence and the possibility of transcendence through mortal struggle. But the Altmer didn't ask for that gift. They had something better, and it was taken from them. Their grievance about this cosmic injustice is, in its own way, legitimate. They genuinely lost something precious, even if the loss happened countless generations ago. Moving forward to more recent history, look at how the Empire treated the Altmer. Tiber Septim conquered Somerset using the Numidium, a weapon of mass destruction that could literally warp reality. The Altmer were forced to submit to human imperial rule not through diplomacy or even fair military conquest, but through overwhelming technological terror. They were incorporated into an empire that worshipped Lorcan in the form of Talos, literally forcing them to live under a government that venerated the entity they consider cosmically responsible for their suffering. For centuries, the Altmer lived as subjects in an empire built by and for humans, where their culture and beliefs were secondary to imperial authority. The empire extracted resources and troops from Somerset while giving relatively little back. When the Oblivion crisis hit, the empire was completely unprepared to defend Somerset. Thousands of Altmer died while the Imperial Legion focused on protecting Cyrodiil. The Altmer had to save themselves, and when they did, the Empire took credit for Martin Septim's sacrifice ending the crisis. From this perspective, the Thalmor's rise to power isn't just naked ambition, it's a response to centuries of human dominance and the Empire's failure to protect its own provinces. The Thalmor offers strength and self-determination to the Altmer after generations of being treated as second-class citizens in their own homeland. Let's talk about the Talos issue specifically. The Thalmor's rejection of Talos worship isn't just theological pedantry, it's about the fundamental nature of divinity and reality. If Tiber Septim, a human warlord who conquered their lands through force, can become a god through sheer will and worship, it undermines the entire Altmer understanding of the cosmos. It suggests that divinity isn't about divine ancestry or cosmic truth, but just about power and belief. That's existentially terrifying to a culture whose entire identity is built on being descendants of gods. Moreover, Tiber Septim used the Numidium, a Dwemer construct, technology stolen from another culture, to force the Altmer to submit. He then ascended to godhood while being worshipped as the conqueror who subjugated the elves. From the Altmer perspective, asking them to respect Talos worship is like asking a conquered people to worship the symbol of their own oppression. It's asking them to accept that their defeat was cosmically ordained and that their conqueror deserves divine status. The ban on Talos worship, seen from this angle, is the Thalmor trying to prevent historical revisionism where their people's suffering is glorified. They're trying to maintain their own narrative about what actually happened and what it meant. Yes, they're using it as a political weapon to destabilize the empire, but the underlying grievance has some validity. Now let's address the Great War. The empire under Titus Mede II was weak, corrupt, and barely holding together. The Dominion's demands before the war, the ban on Talos worship, territorial concessions, tribute, were harsh, but they weren't asking for the empire's complete destruction. They were demanding acknowledgement of reality, that the empire was no longer the dominant power in Tamriel, that the balance of power had shifted. When Titus Mede II refused those demands, he chose war. You can argue that refusing to give in to threats is the principled choice, but it's also the choice that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and the sack of the imperial city. The Thalmor offered a chance to avoid the war entirely. The emperor's pride, and arguably his miscalculation of the empire's military strength, led directly to the bloodiest conflict in recent history. And after all that carnage, after the Battle of the Red Ring and the mutual destruction of both armies, the White Gold Concordat gave the Dominion the same demands they'd made before the war. All those deaths accomplished nothing except proving that the Empire couldn't decisively defeat the Dominion. From the Thalmor perspective, they were right all along about the balance of power, and the war just confirmed it at a terrible cost. Here's another uncomfortable thought. Maybe the Thalmor are right about the Empire being a failed institution. Look at what the Empire has become by the Fourth Era. It lost Morrowind to the Red Year. It lost Black Marsh to the Enchleal. It lost Elsewhere to instability and Dominion influence. It lost Hammerfell when it couldn't honor its commitments to the Red Guards. Skyrim is in open rebellion. The Empire is literally falling apart, unable to maintain order or protect its provinces. The Aldmeri Dominion, by contrast, has successfully united three distinct cultures, Altmer, Bosmer, and Kajit, under a functional government. They've demonstrated military strength, political sophistication, and strategic planning that the Empire can't match. If your metric for legitimacy is the ability to actually govern effectively and maintain stability, the Dominion is doing better than the Empire. Is it tyrannical? Yes. Is it oppressive? Absolutely. But stability and order have value, especially in a world that's constantly threatened by Daedric invasions, dragons, and other apocalyptic dangers. The Thalmor offers certainty and strength in a chaotic world. That's appealing to a lot of people, even if the cost is freedom. Now let's address the most controversial point, their beliefs about racial hierarchy and divinity. This is where things get really uncomfortable, so bear with me. The Altmer genuinely do live longer than humans. They genuinely are more naturally gifted at magic than most other races. Their civilization has produced some of the greatest magical and architectural achievements in Tamrielic history. The Crystal Tower, before it was destroyed, was a pinnacle of magical engineering that humans couldn't replicate. Altmer sorcerers and scholars have preserved ancient knowledge that would have been lost otherwise. If you had a culture that consistently lived for 200 or 300 years, accumulating wisdom and experience that shorter-lived races couldn't match, if your people had innate talents that others had to struggle to achieve, wouldn't you see yourselves as naturally suited to leadership? Wouldn't you believe that your long-term perspective and superior abilities made you better equipped to govern than the shorter-lived races who live in the moment? The problem with Thalmor ideology isn't that they recognize differences between races. Those differences objectively exist in the Elder Scrolls universe. The problem is what they conclude from those differences and how they treat people they consider inferior. But the underlying observation that Altmer have certain advantages isn't wrong, just morally corrupted in its application. There's also the question of whether the Altmer actually are descended from divine beings. In the Elder Scrolls universe, the creation myths aren't just stories, they're descriptions of real events that actually happened. The Aedra exist. Lorkhan's heart was a real physical thing that powered Red Mountain until the Nerevarine destroyed it. The line between mythology and history is blurry because gods and magic are real, verified parts of the world. If the Altmer really are descended from divine spirits, if they really do carry fragments of that original divine essence in their blood, then their claims about their nature aren't just supremacist ideology, they're statements of fact. That doesn't justify oppression or genocide, but it does mean their beliefs about themselves are based on something real, not just invented superiority. Finally, let's talk about the Tower Theory interpretation. If the Thalmor genuinely believe that destroying Mundus would restore their people to divinity, then from their perspective, they're not villains, they're liberators. They're trying to free everyone, including themselves, from a prison of mortality and suffering. Think about what mortality means: death, disease, pain, loss, grief, aging, limitation, all the suffering that comes with being trapped in a physical body. If there was a way to end all of that forever, to return to a state of unlimited existence and divine bliss, would that not be worth pursuing? The counter-argument, of course, is that most people don't want to stop existing, even if you promise them something better on the other side. Humans, Kajit, Argonians, they didn't choose to exist, but now that they do exist, they generally want to keep existing. Unmaking the world to free the elves means destroying countless lives that value their own existence, regardless of whether it's spiritually better to be divine. But from the Thalmor's point of view, those other races are Lorkhan's children, creations of the trickster god specifically designed to perpetuate the mortal prison. They exist as obstacles to liberation, as anchors keeping everyone trapped. Removing them isn't murder, it's removing an impediment to cosmic justice. Again, to be very clear, this logic is monstrous. It's the same logic used by every apocalyptic cult and genocidal ideology in history, that current suffering is justified because of the better world that will come after. But if you genuinely believe in the Altmer creation myth, if you genuinely believe that mortality is a cosmic injustice inflicted on divine beings, then the Thalmor's actions have an internal logic. And that's the point of this entire exercise, not to say the Thalmor are right, but to understand how someone could believe they're right. To see how their worldview, their history, their grievances, and their beliefs form a coherent, if horrifying system that makes sense from within. They're not just evil for evil's sake. They're true believers in a cause they think is cosmically justified, but true belief doesn't exist in a vacuum. These philosophical positions and historical grievances had to translate into actual organizational structure, actual political movements, with actual people making choices. The question becomes how an ideology this extreme actually functions when it has to govern provinces and manage bureaucracies and deploy armies. That's where we need to look at the Thalmor not as an abstract philosophy but as a concrete political entity with internal dynamics. One last thing to consider, the Thalmor aren't a monolithic entity. Like any large political organization, there are probably different factions and opinions within their ranks. Some Thalmor probably do genuinely believe in the cosmological mission to destroy Mundus and return to divinity. Others probably just want merithic supremacy and don't care about the deep metaphysical stuff. Some might be in it for personal power and are using the ideology as a tool. And there are definitely Altmer who oppose the Thalmor entirely, as evidenced by all those refugees they had to hunt down and kill. This internal diversity means there's probably constant political maneuvering within the Thalmor hierarchy. Different factions competing for influence, different interpretations of what their ultimate goals should be, different opinions on tactics and strategy. The Thalmor we see in Skyrim might not represent the full range of thinking within the organization. There's also the question of what comes next. The Fourth Era is setting up for a second Great War. The Thalmor are preparing. The Empire is weakened and divided. When that war comes, and it seems inevitable based on everything in the lore, it's going to reshape Tamriel completely. Will the Dominion win and establish Merethic rule across the continent? Will they push forward with whatever their ultimate plan is regarding the towers and Mundus? Or will they be defeated? And if so, what happens to the millions of Altmer, Bosmer, and Kajit who live under Dominion rule? Would defeating the Thalmor mean punishing all elves for the crimes of their leadership? That seems likely to cause even more problems down the road. The other possibility is that the whole tower theory is wrong, and the Thalmor's goals are more mundane. They just want to rule Tamriel and re-establish elven dominance. In that case, the Second Great War would be a more traditional conflict over power and resources. Still devastating, but not cosmically apocalyptic. There's also the wild card of other forces in play. The return of the dragons, the resurrection of Alduin, the prophecies surrounding the Dragonborn. All of these suggest that there are bigger forces moving in Tamriel than just the political struggles between the Empire and Dominion. Whatever the Thalmor are planning might be disrupted or made irrelevant by these other cosmic events. And we can't forget about the Daedric princes, who have their own agendas and no particular love for either the Empire or the Dominion. If the Thalmor are trying to unmake Mundus, that might be something the princes would oppose, since they derive power and entertainment from mortal affairs. A destroyed Mundus would eliminate their playground. So after going through everything, the history, the beliefs, the rise to power, the strategies, the theories, can we say the Thalmor were right? That depends entirely on your perspective and what you value. If you believe that mortality is a curse and that divine existence is preferable, if you think that cosmic justice demands the correction of Lorkhan's deception, if you value racial purity and ancient hierarchies over individual freedom and equality, then yeah, the Thalmor makes sense. Their actions have internal logic within their belief system. But if you value individual life, if you think that different races and cultures have equal right to exist, if you believe that mortality gives life meaning rather than taking it away, if you think that freedom matters more than order, then the Thalmor are clearly wrong. Their methods are cruel, their ideology is oppressive, and their ultimate goals are genocidal. What we can say for sure is that the Thalmor are way more complex than they first appear. They're not cartoon villains. They're a sophisticated political organization with a coherent worldview, legitimate historical grievances, and goals that make sense within their cultural context. Understanding them doesn't mean agreeing with them, but it does make them more interesting as antagonists. The Thalmor represents something that comes up a lot in real history, a group that has been genuinely wronged in the past, that has legitimate complaints about how they've been treated, but whose response to that injustice is to become oppressors themselves. They've taken their trauma and their grievances and used them to justify doing to others what was done to them. That's a cycle that repeats throughout human history, and Elder Scrolls is using the Thalmor to explore that dynamic in a fantasy context. They also represent the danger of ideology taken to its logical extreme. Start with the belief that you're descended from gods. Add in centuries of being conquered and ruled by others. Stir in some trauma from the Oblivion crisis, and you get an organization that believes it's not just right, but cosmically ordained to rule over or eliminate everyone else. It's a warning about how noble-sounding principles can be corrupted into justifications for atrocity. The genius of Elder Scrolls lore is that it doesn't give you easy answers. The Thalmor aren't evil because they wear black robes and cackle menacingly. They're dangerous because they genuinely believe they're right, because their arguments have just enough validity to be compelling, because their grievances are real even if their response is monstrous. They force you to think about difficult questions regarding justice, revenge, the cycle of oppression, and what happens when wounded people gain power. And that's really the point. The question isn't whether the Thalmor were right, it's what we learn from examining their perspective. What does it tell us about how grievances become extremism? How does a civilization justify atrocity to itself? What happens when the oppressed become the oppressors? These are questions that matter way beyond just video game lore. The Thalmor are right about some things. The Empire did fail them. Talos worship is problematic from their perspective. They have been historically wronged. But being right about diagnosis doesn't make their prescription correct. You can have legitimate grievances without your response being legitimate. So in the end, the Thalmor serve as a fascinating antagonist precisely because they're not purely evil. They're the product of history, trauma, ideology, and the eternal question of how to respond to injustice. Whether they're right or wrong matters less than what examining that question teaches us about moral complexity in a world where gods are real and history has cosmic implications. And that's why Elder Scrolls lore is so damn interesting to dig into. These aren't just simple fantasy villains, they're fully realized cultures with their own perspectives, histories, and justifications. Understanding them means grappling with uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. And honestly, that's what makes the Thalmor such great villains. Not because they're pure evil, but because they're evil that thinks it's good. And that's always the most dangerous kind. Let's dig even deeper into the philosophical underpinnings of Thalmor ideology, because this is where things get really interesting from a metaphysical standpoint. The Altmer view of mortality isn't just about living shorter lives, it's about the fundamental nature of existence and consciousness. In Altmer belief, before the creation of Mundus, the Etada existed in a state of perfect timelessness. There was no past or future, no change or decay, no limitation or boundary. They just were, eternally and completely. Consciousness wasn't fragmented into individual perspectives. It was unified, whole, experiencing everything simultaneously without the restriction of linear time or physical form. Creating Mundus shattered that unity. It forced divine consciousness to be channeled through limited physical forms, experiencing reality one moment at a time, trapped in the prison of linear causality. Imagine going from omniscience to only knowing what your five senses can tell you. Imagine going from eternal existence to knowing you're going to die. From the Altmer perspective, that's not an upgrade, that's a cosmic downgrade of the highest order. And here's where it connects to their actions in the present day. Every moment of suffering in Mundus, every death, every pain, every limitation, all of it traces back to that original act of creation. Lorcan didn't just trick the Aedra into making a world. He cursed all their descendants to endless cycles of suffering, death, rebirth, and suffering again. From this viewpoint, mortality is the ultimate injustice, and anyone trying to perpetuate it or make peace with it is complicit in that injustice. This is why the Thalmor can justify their cruelty. If you genuinely believe that the current world is fundamentally wrong, that existence itself is a prison that needs to be destroyed, then any amount of suffering inflicted in service of that goal becomes morally acceptable. You are not causing harm, you are taking necessary steps toward liberation. The people who die in Thalmor purges, their mortal lives were already worthless prisons. The cultures being destroyed, they were systems designed to perpetuate captivity. The freedom being stripped away, it was illusory freedom within a cage. This is apocalyptic thinking taken to its logical extreme. Apocalyptic movements are among the most dangerous because they operate on a completely different moral framework. If you believe you're ending suffering forever, you can justify any amount of immediate suffering. If you believe you're saving souls, you can excuse any atrocity committed on bodies. But let's steelman their position even further. What if they're actually right about the nature of existence? We know from Elder Scrolls lore that achieving Kim, a state of divine consciousness while remaining yourself, is theoretically possible. Tiber Septim allegedly did it. Vivek claims to have done it. It's a real thing that can happen in this universe. And what Kim represents is essentially what the Altmer claimed their ancestors had before Mundus was created: divine awareness, existence beyond limitation. If Kim is real, if that state of transcendent consciousness is achievable, then the Altmer aren't crazy for wanting to return to it. They're pointing to something that actually exists and saying we should go back there. The question then becomes whether destroying Mundus is the only way to achieve that, and whether they have the right to make that choice for everyone else. This raises profound questions about consent and existence. Nobody consented to be born. The races of Tamriel exist because of Lorkhan's actions that the Altmer never agreed to. But now that these races do exist, they generally don't want to stop existing, regardless of whether there's something better available. Is the Thalmor's plan liberation or genocide? Can it be both? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions, they have direct practical implications. Because if the Thalmor genuinely believe mortality is unjust suffering that must be ended, then their governance philosophy is going to look very different from an empire that accepts the current world as legitimate. This connects to something we haven't fully explored yet: how the Thalmor actually perform as rulers compared to the empire they're trying to replace. Philosophy becomes practice, and we need to look at what that practice actually produces. Let's do something that might make a lot of people uncomfortable. Let's compare the track record of the Third Empire to the track record of the Third Aldmeri Dominion in terms of how they actually govern their territories. Because when you look at it objectively, the picture is more complicated than Empire good, Dominion bad. The Third Empire, especially by the time of the Fourth Era, is a failing colonial power desperately trying to hold onto territories it can no longer adequately govern or protect. Let's look at what happened to its provinces. Morrowind. The Empire did basically nothing to help when Red Mountain erupted. The entire province was devastated. The Dunmer fled as refugees to Skyrim, where they were treated like garbage, and Morrowind never recovered. The Empire extracted resources from Morrowind for centuries but couldn't or wouldn't help when disaster struck. Black Marsh, the Englil, kicked out Imperial authority and the Empire just let it go. After centuries of Argonians being enslaved by Dunmer with Imperial tacit approval, when the Argonians finally asserted independence, the Empire didn't even try to maintain control. Elsewhere, the Empire let the province descend into chaos. The Main was assassinated and the Empire couldn't maintain order. When the Void Knights happened, the Empire had no answers. The Thalmor swooped in with solutions, real or fabricated, and the Empire lost elsewhere without a fight. Hammerfell, the Empire signed a treaty giving away parts of Hammerfell without consulting the Red Guards. When Hammerfell refused and seceded, the Empire let them go. The Red Guards then proceeded to fight the Aldmeri Dominion to a standstill on their own, proving they didn't need the Empire anyway. Skyrim. By the 4th era, Imperial presence in Skyrim is deeply resented. The Talos ban, the perceived weakness in surrendering to the Dominion, the humiliation of having Thalmor agents operate freely in Imperial territory, all of it has sparked a civil war that the Empire can barely manage. So, what has the Empire actually accomplished for its provinces in recent history? It couldn't prevent the Oblivion crisis. It lost multiple provinces. It can't maintain order in the ones it still controls. It surrendered to the Dominion and agreed to terms that make its remaining subjects hate it. What exactly is the Empire offering that's worth preserving? Now compare that to the Aldmeri Dominion. Yes, the Thalmor are authoritarian and oppressive. Yes, they commit atrocities against dissidents. Yes, they believe in racial supremacy, but look at what they've actually accomplished. They successfully integrated 3 radically different cultures, Altmer, Bosmer, and Kajit, into a functioning multiracial state. Despite the Altmer supremacist ideology, the Dominion manages to maintain Bosmer and Kajit participation in government and military. They built a power base from scratch that can challenge the Empire militarily and economically. The Dominion provinces aren't in chaos or rebellion, at least not that we can see. Somerset under Thalmor rule is stable and orderly. Valenwood seems to be functioning. Elsewhere works with the Dominion, rather than constantly chafing under its rule. These provinces have actual functioning governments that can project power and maintain control. The Dominion demonstrated superior military planning and execution during the Great War. Their two-pronged invasion, their intelligence network that identified and eliminated all the Blade's agents, their ability to capture and hold the Imperial City, these weren't flukes. They showed genuine strategic competence. And here's a really uncomfortable thought. Maybe the Dominion is just better at imperialism than the Empire. The Empire's model was always conquer everyone and force them into one system. The Dominion's model seems to be create an alliance where Altmer are in charge, but other races have defined roles, benefits. Is that more cynical? Maybe. But it also might be more sustainable. Look at how the Dominion brought in the Kajit. They solved the Void Knights crisis, or claimed to, which gave the Kajit a tangible reason to be grateful. They didn't just conquer elsewhere, they made the Kajit want to join. That's sophisticated propaganda and statecraft that the Empire never matched. The question becomes whether competent authoritarianism is preferable to incompetent democracy. The Empire claims to be more freedom-loving and egalitarian, but what good is freedom if your province is in ruins and nobody's protecting you? What good is equality if everyone is equally suffering under a failing system? This isn't an endorsement of the Thalmor's methods. It's pointing out that the Empire's moral high ground is built on pretty shaky foundations. The Empire has been responsible for plenty of oppression, conquest, and cultural destruction over its history. Tiber Septim used the Numidium to force compliance. The Empire tacitly allowed Dunmer slavery for centuries. Imperial governors could be brutal and corrupt. The Empire's rule wasn't some benevolent paradise, it was just a different flavor of imperialism. The real difference is that the Empire has nostalgia and tradition on its side. People remember the glory days under the Septims, back when the Empire was strong and could actually protect its provinces. But that Empire is gone. The current Empire is a zombie shuffling toward collapse, maintained by inertia and the fact that nobody has a better alternative ready to go. The Dominion, by contrast, is young and dynamic and confident. They're the rising power with momentum on their side. History generally favors rising powers over declining ones, regardless of which one is more moral. The question isn't whether the Thalmor are good, it's whether they're the future, whether we like it or not. But systems don't run themselves. Both the Empire and the Dominion are made up of individual people making individual choices. This raises an important question we haven't addressed. In a system this oppressive, how much responsibility do individual agents bear? When we talk about the Thalmor as this efficient, brutal machine, we're really talking about thousands of individual Altmer, Bosmer, and Kajit who choose to participate in that machine every day. That choice is where ideology meets reality. Here's another angle we need to examine: individual Thalmor agents and the question of personal responsibility. When you encounter Thalmor justiciars in Skyrim, are they evil individuals or just people following orders in a system they didn't create? Think about your average justiciar. They're probably a young Altmer who grew up in Somerset after the Thalmor came to power. Everything they know about history comes from Thalmor-approved education. They've been taught from childhood that the Altmer are divinely superior, that humans are Lorkhan's tools, that the Empire oppressed their people for generations. They genuinely believe that enforcing the Talos ban is justice, that hunting down Talos worshippers is protecting the cosmic order. From their perspective, they're the good guys. They're standing up for their people's rights after centuries of oppression. They're enforcing a treaty that the Empire voluntarily signed. They're trying to prevent humans from worshipping a false god whose very existence is an insult to everything the Altmer holds sacred. They see themselves as warriors for justice, not oppressors. Does that excuse the torture, the secret prisons, the violence? Absolutely not. But it explains how they can do these things while still thinking they're righteous. They've been indoctrinated into a system that tells them these actions are necessary and good. Most of them probably aren't sadists who enjoy hurting people. They're true believers who think suffering inflicted on enemies of the Dominion is justified. This is how most atrocities happen, not by people who know they're doing wrong, but by ordinary people who've convinced themselves they're serving a higher purpose. The Thalmor agents you meet in Skyrim genuinely think they're the heroes of the story. That's what makes them dangerous. But what about the Thalmor leadership? The first emissary, the inner council, the ones making policy? They can't claim ignorance or indoctrination. They know exactly what they're doing. They understand the torture, the purges, the propaganda, the manipulation. They're consciously choosing these methods to achieve their goals. Even then, though, they probably justify it to themselves. They tell themselves that tough choices are necessary to achieve cosmic justice, that you can't make a paradise without breaking some eggs, that the suffering they cause now will be erased when they achieve their ultimate goal of returning the Altmer to divinity. It's still monstrous, but it's conscious monstrosity that thinks it's serving good. This creates a moral puzzle. Should we judge the foot soldiers of an oppressive system the same way we judge its architects? The justiciar who tortures prisoners was following orders and genuinely believes in what they're doing. The policymakers who gave those orders can't claim the same excuse. But both are complicit in the system's atrocities. Where do you draw the line? The answer isn't simple. Different people following orders have different levels of agency, different amounts of information, different choices available to them. But the question itself matters because it forces us to think about responsibility in systems of oppression. The Thalmor system is designed to prevent internal dissent. Altmer who question Thalmor doctrine become refugees and hunted by death squads. Kajit and Bosmer who don't support the Dominion are marginalized or worse. There's no safety in opposition, no protected space for dissent. In that environment, most people conform, whether they want to or not. But there's another layer to this question of individual choice and systemic pressure that we haven't explored: biological reality. The choices individual Thalmor make, the perspectives they hold, are shaped not just by ideology and fear, but by something more basic: how long they live. An Altmer justiciar and a Nord rebel aren't just fighting over politics. They're operating from fundamentally different experiences of time itself. This biological difference translates into political philosophy in ways that make the conflict almost inevitable. Let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough: the political implications of different racial lifespans. Altmer live for 200 to 300 years on average. Humans live for maybe 80 years if they're lucky. Kajit and Bosmer fall somewhere in between. These aren't minor differences. They completely reshape how different races think about governance and change. When you live for 3 centuries, you think in terms of centuries. An Altmer politician can personally remember events from 200 years ago. They can implement policies knowing they'll be alive to see the results in 100 years. They can play long games that would span multiple human generations. This gives the Thalmor a huge advantage in strategic thinking. While human leaders are scrambling to achieve something during their brief time in power, Thalmor leaders can wait. They can set plans in motion that won't pay off for decades, knowing they'll still be around to see it through. The manipulation of Ulfric's Stormcloak is a perfect example. They captured him during the Great War, and now, 30 years later, he's still serving their purposes. From a human perspective, that's a lifetime. From an Altmer perspective, it's recent history. This also affects how they view change and tradition. Humans see rapid change as normal because their lives are short. One human lifetime can see multiple complete political upheavals, but Altmer live long enough that change happens more slowly from their perspective. The Tiber Septim conquest that feels like ancient history to Nords in the 4th era, there are Altmer alive who personally remember it. There might even be a few who were adults when it happened. This creates a fundamentally different relationship to history. For humans, history is stories about dead people. For Altmer, history is stuff their grandparents told them about firsthand. The wounds from past conflicts don't heal as quickly because the people who suffered them are still alive, still holding grudges, still remembering. From this perspective, the Thalmor's focus on ancient grievances makes more sense. They're not obsessing over the distant past, they're responding to wrongs that occurred within living memory of their leadership. The humiliation of Tiber Septim's conquest is as fresh to them as recent events are to humans. You wouldn't tell someone to just get over a major trauma because some time has passed, right? This also affects their view of human-dominated institutions. The Empire has only existed for about 700 years by the time of Skyrim. That's about 3 Altmer lifespans. It's recent in their view. Meanwhile, Altmer civilization has existed for thousands of years. From their perspective, human empires are temporary things that come and go, while elven culture is eternal. Why should they submit to a Johnny-come-lately human empire when their own civilization is so much older and more enduring? The counter-argument is that age doesn't equal wisdom, and longevity doesn't give you the right to rule others. But from an Altmer perspective, it kind of does. If you've personally lived through 3 centuries of history, seen empires rise and fall, accumulated knowledge and experience that shorter-lived races can't match, doesn't that make you more qualified to lead? Doesn't your longer perspective give you better judgment about long-term consequences? This is what makes the conflict between the Empire and the Dominion so intractable. It's not just political or military, it's based on fundamentally different ways of experiencing time and history. Humans want change and dynamism because their lives are short and they need to make their mark quickly. Altmer wants stability and tradition because they have time to see how poorly hasty changes usually work out. Neither perspective is objectively right or wrong. They're both valid responses to different biological realities, but they're incompatible enough that compromise becomes nearly impossible. The Thalmor aren't just trying to defeat the Empire. They're trying to impose a longer-term view of politics and society on races that literally can't think that way because they don't live long enough. And this creates a fascinating dynamic within the Dominion itself. Because the Thalmor aren't just ruling over Altmer, they're leading a coalition that includes Bosmer and Kajit, races with different lifespans and different relationships to time. The Bosmer live longer than humans, but not as long as Altmer, putting them somewhere in the middle. The Kajit have lifespans similar to humans. So how does an ideology built on Altmer temporal experience maintain loyalty from races who don't share that experience? The answer tells us a lot about how the Dominion actually functions as a multiracial empire. We focused a lot on the Altmer, but we should talk about the Bosmer's role in all this. The Wood Elves make up a significant part of the Dominion's population and military. They're not just conquered subjects, they're participants in the system. So what's their deal? Bosmer have their own complicated history with humans and the Empire. The Green Pact, their religious covenant with Y'ffre, forbids them from harming plants in Valenwood. This makes them dependent on imported food and gives outside powers leverage over them. The Empire controlled those trade routes for centuries. When the Thalmor offered to take over that role, it wasn't just about politics, it was about survival. There's also the fact that Bosmer are Mer, like the Altmer. While the Thalmor ideology is definitely Altmer supremacist, it's also Mer supremacist more broadly. The Bosmer might be viewed as junior partners rather than equals, but they're still considered superior to humans, Kajit, and Argonians. That's an appealing hierarchy if you're a Bosmer who doesn't want to be at the bottom. During the Second Aldmeri Dominion, the Thalmor essentially invaded Valenwood and set up a provisional government. But in the Third Dominion, Bosmer sympathizers actually helped overthrow imperial rule. This wasn't a conquest, it was a coup from within. Enough Bosmer decided they'd rather be ruled by Altmer than Imperials that they actively worked to make it happen. Why would they do that? Maybe they genuinely believe in Mirethic supremacy. Maybe they're pragmatists who saw that the Dominion was rising and the Empire was falling. Maybe they have their own grudges against Imperial rule that we don't know about. Maybe the Thalmor offered them something the Empire couldn't or wouldn't. The uncomfortable reality is that the Dominion isn't just the Altmer oppressing everyone else. It's a coalition where multiple elven cultures have decided to work together with the Altmer in the lead role. The Bosmer are complicit in everything the Thalmor do. They provide troops, resources, political support. They benefit from the system even if they're not at the top of it. This is true of any empire or large political structure. There are always collaborators from conquered or subordinate populations who decide that working with the system is better than opposing it. The Bosmer who serve in Thalmor bureaucracy or military aren't victims, they're partners, even if it's an unequal partnership. Some Bosmer probably do oppose the Thalmor quietly, but enough support them, or at least go along with them, that Valen would remain stable under Dominion rule. That support is based on calculations about what benefits their people, even if it means accepting Altmer supremacy. The Bosmer case shows us willing collaboration based on shared racial identity and practical benefits. But not every Dominion member joined for the same reasons. Some were manipulated through more sophisticated means, their entire worldview hijacked to serve Thalmor interests. That brings us to perhaps the most cynical piece of Thalmor statecraft, how they turned the Kajit into loyal subjects through theological manipulation. The Kajit situation is even more complex. They're not Mer, they're beast folk with their own completely different origin story. But they're full members of the Aldmeri Dominion, providing troops and accepting Thalmor authority. Why? The answer comes down to those Void Knights and what the Thalmor promised afterward. Kajit religion is deeply tied to the moons Joan and Jode, Maser and Secunda. Their entire sense of identity, their spiritual practices, their understanding of their place in the cosmos, all of it depends on the moons being there. When the moons vanished, it wasn't just scary. It was theologically catastrophic. If the moons could disappear, what did that mean about the Kajit's place in creation? Were they abandoned by their deities? Was their entire religious understanding wrong? The existential crisis was total. Then the Thalmor claim they brought the moons back. Whether this is true or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is that the Kajit believe it, and that belief creates a debt. The Thalmor positioned themselves as the saviors of the Kajit race, the ones who restored cosmic order when it was breaking down. That's powerful magic, in both the literal and metaphorical sense. So now, the Kajit are in a position where they feel they owe the Thalmor everything. Their entire existence as a race was threatened, and the Thalmor saved them. How do you repay that kind of debt? By supporting the Dominion, providing troops for its wars, accepting its political authority even when you might prefer independence. This is a different kind of control than what the Thalmor exercise over the Bosmer or their own Altmer population. With the Kajit, it's based on perceived obligation and gratitude rather than shared racial identity or military conquest. The Thalmor have made themselves necessary to the Kajit's spiritual well-being. That's a more insidious form of control because it's self-reinforcing. The Kajit police themselves based on their belief in what they owe. And here's the really clever part. The Thalmor don't have to maintain that control actively. The Kajit maintain it themselves through their own culture and beliefs. As long as Kajit religion teaches that the Thalmor saved the moons, as long as that event is remembered as a miracle rather than a probable lie, the Kajit will remain loyal to the Dominion. This is information warfare and psychological manipulation at its most sophisticated. The Thalmor have created a mythology around themselves that serves their interests and is maintained by the very people it controls. It's brilliant and horrifying at the same time, but it also means the Kajit aren't just innocent victims. They're making a choice to believe the Thalmor's claims, to support the Dominion, to provide troops for wars against the Empire. That choice might be based on false information, but they're still making it. They're still participants in the system, not just its targets. So now we have this complex three-way alliance. Altmer supremacists who believe they're cosmically superior, Bosmer who've calculated that partnership beats subordination, and Kajit who feel they owe an existential debt. This coalition is what's facing off against a crumbling empire and independent states. And that brings us to the inevitable question: what happens when this unstable balance finally collapses? Because the current situation can't last forever. Either the Dominion wins, the Empire wins, or something else intervenes. Each outcome carries its own implications. Let's engage in some speculation about what happens after the Second Great War, whenever that comes, because based on everything we've discussed, the current situation is unsustainable. The tense standoff between the Empire and Dominion will eventually explode into open conflict again. So what happens then? Scenario 1, the Dominion wins decisively. The Empire collapses completely. Cyrodiil becomes a vassal state or gets partitioned among victorious Dominion forces. Skyrim probably achieves independence in the chaos, but ends up isolated and vulnerable. High Rock gets absorbed into the Dominion. What's left of Hammerfell might hold out independently, but would be surrounded. In this scenario, we'd see the establishment of a new Merethic era, just like the Thalmor want. Tamriel would be divided between territories under direct Dominion control and independent regions that have to accommodate Thalmor power to survive. Human culture would be subordinated or suppressed. Talos worship would be completely eliminated. The Dominion would be the dominant power on the continent for the foreseeable future. Would this actually be worse for the average person than the current situation? Maybe not. Ironically, the civil wars would end. Trade routes would be secured. The Dominion has proven it can maintain order in its territories. Life under Thalmor rule might be oppressive, but it would be stable. And stability often matters more to ordinary people than abstract concepts of freedom. Scenario 2. The Empire wins decisively. The Aldmeri Dominion collapses or is forced to withdraw back to Somerset and give up Valenwood and elsewhere. The Thalmor lose power, possibly replaced by Altmer factions more willing to work with the Empire. This scenario is actually more problematic than it sounds. What happens to all the Altmer, Bosmer, and Kajit who supported or served the Thalmor? Do they face reprisals, mass arrests, property confiscation? The Empire would need to decide whether to punish everyone complicit in Thalmor rule or try to reconcile and move forward. Given the amount of bad blood, reconciliation seems unlikely. You'd also have the problem that the resentments that drove the Thalmor to power in the first place wouldn't just disappear. The Altmer would still feel they'd been wronged historically. Without the Thalmor to channel those grievances, you'd probably see other extremist movements pop up. The cycle would continue. Scenario 3. Stalemate and partition. Neither side wins decisively. Tamriel becomes permanently divided between Imperial and Dominion spheres of influence, with some provinces remaining independent or switching sides periodically. This is probably the most realistic outcome based on how the Great War ended. In this scenario, you'd have permanent tension with no resolution, constant political maneuvering, proxy conflicts, border skirmishes, but no total war because both sides are too evenly matched. The Dominion controls the south and west. The Empire hangs on to Cyrodiil, High Rock, and maybe Skyrim. Hammerfell stays independent. Everyone builds up their military and waits for an advantage. This would be the worst outcome for ordinary people because the instability would continue indefinitely. Trade would suffer. Border regions would be militarized and dangerous. Constant, low-level conflict would drain resources and kill people without resolving anything. But it's probably what we'd actually get, because total victory is really hard to achieve when powers are closely matched. Scenario 4. Something completely different happens that makes the Empire-Dominion conflict irrelevant. Maybe the dragons return in force and everyone has to unite against them. Maybe the Daedric princes make a major move. Maybe some other threat emerges that puts everything in perspective. In this scenario, the Thalmor either become allies against a common enemy or become just one more problem in a world full of bigger problems. This is the Deus Ex Machina solution, and it's not satisfying from a storytelling perspective, but it's how these things often work in real history. Conflicts that seem all-consuming get pushed aside when something more urgent comes along. The Thalmor's carefully laid plans could be disrupted by forces they didn't account for. But here's the interesting thing. All of these scenarios assume the world continues to exist. If the Tower theory is right, if the Thalmor are actually trying to unmake Mundus, then none of these scenarios matter. The winning scenario from the Thalmor perspective isn't military victory, it's cosmic dissolution. They're playing a different game than everyone else realizes. Which raises a final question. If the Thalmor succeed in destroying all the towers and unmaking Mundus, what happens to everyone else? Do they all die? Do they ascend with the Ultmer? Do they return to some kind of pre-creation state? Is it liberation or annihilation? The terrifying answer is that probably nobody knows, not even the Thalmor. They're operating on ancient theology and philosophical speculation, not on verified knowledge of what happens when you destroy the cosmic support structures of reality. They might be wrong about everything. Destroying the towers might not restore anyone to divinity, it might just kill everyone and leave nothing behind. They could be leading everyone, including themselves, toward collective suicide based on misunderstood scripture, and that's what makes them so dangerous. It's not that they're evil, it's that they're absolutely certain they're right about something nobody can actually know for sure. True believers are always the scariest antagonists because they can't be reasoned with. You can't compromise with someone who thinks they're enacting cosmic justice. This certainty, this absolute conviction, is rooted in something deeper than just political ideology. It comes from their entire understanding of existence, mortality, and what it means to be alive in a world they believe shouldn't exist in the first place. To really grasp why the Thalmor can justify anything, we need to dig into the philosophical bedrock beneath all their political maneuvering, because their actions in the world are symptoms of a deeper sickness, or from their perspective, a deeper truth. After everything we've covered, here's what I think is the most important point about the Thalmor. They're tragic figures. And I don't mean tragic in the sense of being sympathetic or pitiable. I mean tragic in the classical Greek sense, where character flaws and circumstances combine to create inevitable disaster. The Thalmor took real grievances, historical oppression, cultural suppression, the humiliation of conquest, and let those grievances curdle into something monstrous. They had legitimate complaints about how the Empire treated the Altmer, but their response was to become exactly what they claimed to oppose. They went from victims of imperialism to practitioners of an even more brutal form of it. They took a valid philosophical position, that mortality involves suffering and limitation, and twisted it into justification for genocide. They took pride in their heritage and culture and corrupted it into supremacist ideology. They took strategic brilliance and used it in service of goals that require the destruction of everyone who disagrees with them. What makes them tragic is that they could have been different. The first Aldmeri Dominion under Queen Iron was relatively progressive. It recognized merit regardless of race. It tried to unite different cultures without crushing their identities. It sought to protect rather than dominate. The Thalmor could have followed that model. They could have built something genuinely better than the Empire. Instead, they let trauma and resentment guide their choices. They became a cautionary tale about what happens when the oppressed gain power but haven't healed from their oppression. They replicate the patterns that hurt them, but more efficiently, with better justification, with cosmic rhetoric backing up their right to inflict suffering on others. And the real tragedy is that they're probably doomed regardless of what happens. If they achieve their goals through the Tower Theory, they're gambling everything on theological speculation that might be completely wrong. If they conquer Tamriel through conventional means, they'll face endless insurgencies and resistance that will force them into ever more oppressive tactics. If they lose to the Empire, they'll be punished for everything they've done, and the cycle of resentment will continue into the next era. There's no good ending for the Thalmor. They're locked into a trajectory that leads either to their destruction or to something worse, their victory. Because their victory means the end of freedom, diversity, cultural exchange, and possibly reality itself. They're the antagonists of their own story as much as everyone else's. But here's the uncomfortable truth I keep coming back to. Understanding why they think they're right doesn't mean they are right, but it does mean we can't just dismiss them as evil for evil's sake. They're the product of history, ideology, trauma, and the eternal human, or in this case, elven tendency to believe that our suffering justifies any action we take in response. The Thalmor represent a warning about letting grievances define you, about the danger of believing you're cosmically ordained to rule, about what happens when powerful people decide that their vision of the world mattering more than everyone else's existence. These are lessons that apply way beyond video game lore. They're patterns that repeat throughout real history, in every culture, in every era. So were the Thalmor right. From within their own belief system and worldview, yes, they're internally consistent, logically following their premises to their conclusions. But their premises are based on supremacy, their logic leads to genocide, and their conclusions require the end of everything. Being right in your own head doesn't make you right in reality. And when your version of being right requires everyone else to die or suffer, maybe your standards for being right need recalibration. The fascinating thing about Elder Scrolls is that it doesn't shy away from these moral complexities. The Thalmor aren't orcs in black armor who exist to be villains. They're a fully realized culture with history, motivations, internal politics, and genuine beliefs. They believe they're the heroes of their own story, and from certain angles, you can almost see how they got there. But seeing how they got there doesn't mean accepting where they ended up. Understanding the Thalmor means recognizing both their legitimate grievances and their monstrous responses to those grievances. It means acknowledging that they have points about imperial hypocrisy while rejecting their supremacist conclusions. It means being able to hold multiple uncomfortable truths at once, that they were wronged, that their response is unjustifiable, that they're brilliant strategists, that their goals are horrifying, that they genuinely believe they're saving the world, that they're actually trying to destroy it. That's the genius of their portrayal. The Thalmor work as antagonists precisely because they're not simple. They're the kind of enemy that makes you think, that makes you question assumptions, that forces you to grapple with difficult moral questions. They're villains you can understand without agreeing with, antagonists who are wrong but not stupid, oppressors who were once oppressed themselves. And maybe that's the ultimate answer to whether they're right about enough things, that their wrongness becomes more insidious. Pure evil is easy to identify and oppose, but evil that comes wrapped in legitimate grievances, philosophical sophistication, and strategic brilliance, that's the kind that actually wins sometimes, because people can convince themselves to go along with it. The Thalmor are a reminder that the most dangerous ideologies are the ones that contain grains of truth wrapped in monstrous conclusions. That the worst atrocities are often committed by people who genuinely believe they're serving justice. That the road to hell is paved with good intentions, divine mandates, and the absolute certainty that you're right and everyone else is wrong. So no, the Thalmor aren't right. But they're right enough to be dangerous, and that's what makes them such perfect antagonists for a morally complex fantasy universe. They're wrong in the ways that matter most, but right in enough small ways that you can trace the path from legitimate grievance to cosmic horror. And that path is worth studying because it shows how ideology can corrupt even legitimate causes. We've been talking about the Thalmor as a monolithic entity, but let's look at some specific individuals we encounter in the games and what they tell us about the organization. Because the Thalmor aren't just a faceless bureaucracy, they're made up of actual people with their own personalities, motivations, and methods. First, Emissary Elenwen is probably the most visible Thalmor character in Skyrim. She runs the Thalmor embassy and serves as the primary representative of Dominion interests in the province. What's interesting about Elenwen is how carefully she plays the political game. She's not a raving fanatic. She's a smooth operator who understands how to manipulate both the Empire and the Stormcloaks for Dominion advantage. At the meeting at High Hrothgar, where both sides in the Civil War come together, Elenwen tries to insert herself into the proceedings. She wants to be part of the negotiations, not because the Thalmor care about peace in Skyrim, but because being at the table gives her influence over the outcome. When she's thrown out, she goes without making a huge scene, because she understands that sometimes you take the loss and regroup, rather than forcing a confrontation that makes you look weak. Elenwen is also the one who interrogated Ulfric during the Great War. She broke him psychologically and turned him into an asset without him even fully realizing it. That takes skill and patience and a deep understanding of human psychology. She's not just following orders or repeating ideology, she's actively crafting strategy and executing it over decades. This tells us that at least some Thalmor leaders are highly intelligent, patient, and strategic thinkers. They're not cartoon villains. They're sophisticated operators who understand power and how to accumulate it. That makes them much more dangerous than if they were just zealots. Then there's Ancano, the Thalmor advisor at the College of Winterhold. He's there ostensibly as a diplomatic observer, but really he's trying to secure magical artifacts and knowledge for the Thalmor. When the Eye of Magnus is discovered, Ancano tries to harness its power for himself. There's debate in the lore community about whether Ancano was acting on Thalmor orders or going rogue. The evidence suggests he went rogue. There's a letter at the embassy basically asking him to report in and wondering what he's doing. But what's interesting is that even as a rogue agent, Ancano still exemplifies Thalmor ideology and methods. When he's confronted about using the eye, his response is revealing. He says something like, "You think I don't know what you're up to? You think I can't destroy you? The power to unmake the world at my fingertips, and you think you can do anything about it?" That's Thalmor thinking in a nutshell. Absolute confidence in their superiority, willingness to threaten apocalypse to get what they want, belief that they should have access to any power regardless of the consequences. Even if the Thalmor leadership didn't send Ancano to capture the Eye, they created the mindset that made him think it was a good idea. He's a product of their system, and his actions reflect what that system values: power, superiority, and the willingness to risk everything to achieve your goals. Ondolomar is another interesting case. He's the Thalmor justiciar in Markarth, and you can interact with him during several quests. What's notable about Ondolomar is that he's completely open about Thalmor goals and ideology. He'll tell you straight up that the Thalmor believe in Merethic supremacy, that they're working to establish elven dominance over Tamriel, that the ban on Talos worship is just the beginning of their plans. He's not trying to hide what the Thalmor are doing or sugarcoat it for a Nord audience. He's confident enough to just state their position openly and dare anyone to oppose it. That confidence comes from knowing that the Thalmor have enough power that they don't need to pretend anymore. They can say the quiet part out loud because what's anyone going to do about it? But Ondolomar also offers quests where he asks you to gather evidence against Talos worshippers. He's not just randomly torturing people, he's building legal cases, collecting evidence, following procedures. It's oppression through bureaucracy, using the forms of law to give legitimacy to persecution. That's more insidious than simple violence because it creates the appearance of justice while serving injustice. Then there are the random justiciar patrols you encounter on the roads. These are the rank and file Thalmor, the ones actually enforcing policy on the ground. They're usually traveling with Nord prisoners they've arrested for Talos worship. They're hostile if you question their authority or admit to worshipping Talos yourself. These agents are interesting because they represent what the Thalmor looks like to most people in Skyrim. Not smooth diplomats or brilliant strategists, but armed enforcers who can arrest you for your religious beliefs and take you to secret prisons where you might be tortured or disappear. They're the face of occupation and oppression. But from their perspective, they're just doing their jobs. They're enforcing a treaty that the Empire signed. They're preventing worship of a false god. They're maintaining order and protecting Dominion interests. Most of them probably don't think of themselves as villains. They think they're the thin gold line between chaos and civilization. What all these characters tell us is that the Thalmor aren't uniform. They have different personalities, different roles, different levels of fanaticism. Some are true believers who would die for the cause. Others are careerists who saw the Thalmor as a path to power and prestige. Some are intelligent strategists playing complex games. Others are simple enforcers following orders. But they all share certain commonalities: belief in Merethic supremacy, willingness to use violence and oppression to achieve their goals, confidence that history is on their side, and certainty that they're serving a greater purpose. Those shared beliefs create a culture that can encompass both sophisticated diplomats and brutal thugs while maintaining ideological coherence. And that culture doesn't sustain itself through ideology alone. Understanding individual Thalmor like Elenwen, Ancano, and Ondolemar is important, but they're operating within a system that's been carefully designed to maximize control and minimize resistance. Their individual talents and fanaticism are weapons, but the system itself is the force multiplier. To really understand how the Thalmor maintain power across 3 provinces with different cultures, we need to look at the machinery of oppression they've built. Let's talk more specifically about how the Thalmor actually operate on a practical level, because their methods are as interesting as their ideology. They've created a system that's remarkably effective at maintaining control while creating the appearance of legitimacy. First, there's the use of law and bureaucracy. The Thalmor don't just show up and start killing people randomly. They use the legal authority granted by the white gold concordat to justify their actions. They arrest people for violating the Talos worship ban. They hold trials, they keep records, they follow procedures. It's oppression through paperwork. This serves multiple purposes. It makes their actions seem legitimate and orderly rather than arbitrary and violent. It creates documentation that can be used to implicate others. One prisoner's testimony can lead to a dozen more arrests. It forces the Empire to be complicit in enforcing unjust laws because the Empire agreed to the treaty. It also makes resistance harder. You can't just fight back against the Thalmor without also fighting the legal authority of the Empire. Anyone who opposes Thalmor actions is technically opposing imperial law, making them criminals rather than freedom fighters. That's a brilliant bit of manipulation. The Thalmor have made the Empire enforce its own oppression. Second, there's the intelligence network. The Thalmor maintain extensive spy networks throughout Imperial territory. They gather information on potential threats, identify Talos worshippers, monitor political developments, and report back to the Dominion. This is how they were able to identify and kill all those Blades agents before the Great War started. But the intelligence operation isn't just about gathering information, it's about creating paranoia. When people know they might be watched, they self-censor. They don't talk about Talos worship even in private. They don't express anti-Thalmor sentiments where anyone might overhear. The uncertainty about who might be an informant makes everyone suspicious of everyone else, fracturing communities and preventing organized resistance. Third, there's the use of secret prisons and torture. Places like Northwatch Keep, where the Thalmor take prisoners who then disappear. Nobody knows what happens there, which is part of the point. The uncertainty is scarier than knowing for sure. Families don't know if their loved ones are alive or dead. People who speak out against the Thalmor might vanish, and nobody knows what happened to them. This creates a climate of fear that makes open resistance nearly impossible. You can't organize against an enemy who might make you disappear in the night. You can't build a movement when nobody knows who they can trust. The Thalmor use terror strategically, applying just enough violence to keep people afraid without applying so much that it sparks uprising. Fourth, there's the political manipulation. We've already talked about Ulfric and how the Thalmor manipulated him into starting the civil war, but that's just one example of their political operations. They fund dissidents in provinces they want to destabilize. They spread propaganda that serves their interests. They exploit existing divisions and grievances to further their goals. This is sophisticated statecraft that requires patience and planning. The Thalmor aren't just winning through military might. They're winning through making their enemies weaken themselves. That's the mark of a truly dangerous opponent. Fifth, there's the propaganda and narrative control. The Thalmor carefully manage the story of who they are and what they've accomplished. They took credit for ending the Oblivion crisis in Somerset, regardless of the truth. They claim to have restored the moons, regardless of whether they actually did. They present themselves as the saviors of the Mare and the rightful rulers of Tamriel. This narrative work is crucial because it provides ideological justification for their actions. If you're the saviors who ended the Oblivion crisis, then your claim to rule seems more legitimate. If you're the ones who restored the moons, then the Kajit owe you everything. If you're descended from gods, then your supremacy is cosmically ordained. The story you tell about yourself determines how others see you, and the Thalmor are masters of that story. All of these methods work together to create a system that's much more effective than simple military occupation. The Thalmor have built a machine for converting power into control, for turning force into legitimacy, for making oppression seem like law and order. That's what makes them such formidable antagonists. They're not just strong, they're smart about how they use their strength. But here's the question that machine raises. Once you've built a system this sophisticated, this totalizing, this effective at suppressing dissent and perpetuating itself, can it ever be changed from within? The very efficiency that makes the Thalmor dangerous is also what makes them potentially irredeemable. They've created a structure that resists modification, that punishes deviation, that can only reinforce its own extremism. Which brings us to an uncomfortable question. Here's something we haven't discussed much. Could the Thalmor be reformed? Is there a version of events where the organization that's committed so many atrocities could change course and become something less monstrous? The optimistic view says yes. After all, the first Aldmeri Dominion under Queen Erin was relatively progressive. It's possible to have a merethic alliance that respects other races and cultures while still advancing Mare interests. The name Thalmor doesn't have to be synonymous with supremacy and oppression. It's just become that way over time. If moderate elements within the Thalmor could seize power, if enough Altmer became disgusted with the extremism and violence, if the costs of maintaining their current course became too high, then maybe the organization could reform itself from within. Maybe a new generation of Thalmor leaders could emerge who want alliance rather than domination, cooperation rather than conquest. But the pessimistic view says this is wishful thinking. The third Thalmor came to power through violence and purges. They've eliminated dissent within their own ranks, killed or driven out everyone who opposed them, and created an ideological culture where questioning the party line means death. How do you reform an organization that's designed to prevent reform? There's also the problem that the Thalmor's ideology is deeply rooted in their understanding of cosmology and history. They don't just think they should rule, they think they're cosmically ordained to rule, that they're descended from gods, that the current world is fundamentally unjust. Those aren't positions you can moderate or compromise on. Either you believe divinity flows through your bloodline, or you don't. Either you think Lorcan committed cosmic crime, or you don't. The structure of Thalmor power also makes reform difficult. They've built a system where loyalty is rewarded and dissent is punished, where the most extreme voices dominate discourse, where anyone who suggests moderation is seen as weak or traitorous. That creates a ratchet effect where the organization can only move in one direction, toward greater extremism. Revolutionary movements that seize power through violence and ideology rarely moderate once they're in control. They're more likely to become more extreme over time as internal factions compete to prove their ideological purity. The moderate voices get purged or silenced, and the fanatics take over. The Thalmor have followed this pattern already. There's also the question of whether reform would even be meaningful at this point. The Thalmor have committed atrocities: the Night of Green Fire, the purges, the secret prisons, the torture, the ethnic cleansing. Can an organization responsible for those things be reformed, or does it need to be dissolved entirely and replaced with something new? This is the same question that comes up after any regime responsible for mass violence. Do you try to reform the institutions that committed the atrocities, or do you tear them down and start over? There are arguments for both approaches, and neither is clearly superior. Reform means you keep institutional knowledge and experience. You avoid the chaos of complete dissolution. You give people who were part of the system a path to redemption. But it also means that the organization remains tainted by its past, that victims have to accept that their oppressors are still in power, that justice might never be fully served. Dissolution means you make a clean break with the past, you send a clear message that the old ways are over, you create space for something genuinely new. But it also means you lose everything the organization knew and could do. You create power vacuums that can be filled by something worse. You might drive former members underground where they can rebuild in secret. For the Thalmor, both options seem unlikely to happen peacefully. Reform would require people currently in power to give up that power voluntarily, to admit they were wrong, to accept punishment for their actions. When has that ever happened? Dissolution would require defeating them militarily and politically, which the Empire doesn't seem capable of doing right now. So we're probably stuck with the Thalmor as they are until some external force changes the equation. Either they achieve their goals, or they're defeated by someone who can actually beat them, or they destroy themselves through internal contradictions. But reform through internal change, that seems like the least likely scenario. And that impossibility of reform, that locked-in trajectory toward either total victory or total defeat, is exactly why the Thalmor matter as more than just video game villains. They're a case study in how movements become so extreme they can't back down, so committed they can't compromise, so certain they can learn. These patterns appear throughout the history of Tamriel itself, which is why we need to talk about what studying the Thalmor actually teaches us. We're coming up on 2 hours of deep lore analysis, so let me bring this home with why any of this matters beyond just Elder Scrolls trivia. Because the Thalmor aren't just interesting as fictional villains, they're interesting as a complete exploration of a faction's ideology, history, and motivations. The pattern the Thalmor represent shows something we see throughout Elder Scrolls history. A group that's been genuinely wronged becomes radicalized. They develop an ideology that justifies their resentment and superiority. They seize power during a crisis when traditional authorities are weakened. They purge internal dissent and eliminate opposition. They use law and bureaucracy to make their oppression seem legitimate. They create propaganda narratives that position them as victims and heroes simultaneously. This is consistent world building. The Thalmor's rise through the Oblivion crisis mirrors how other factions in Elder Scrolls have seized power during emergencies. Their use of legal authority mirrors how oppressive regimes work within the lore. Their manipulation of historical grievances is something we see across multiple Elder Scrolls stories and cultures. The Thalmor illustrate how grievances can be both legitimate and badly directed. The Altmer really were conquered and oppressed by the Empire. That's not made up, it actually happened in the lore. But but their response, becoming oppressors themselves, embracing supremacist ideology, potentially trying to destroy the world, that's where legitimate grievance turns into illegitimate action. The Thalmor also show how ideology can make smart people pursue catastrophic goals. The Thalmor leaders aren't idiots, they're brilliant strategists and administrators. But their ideology has them convinced that destroying the towers and unmaking Mundus is a good idea, based on theological speculation that might be completely wrong. They're gambling with the existence of everyone and everything because they've convinced themselves they're right. That's the danger of absolute certainty. The smarter you are, the better you are at rationalizing positions that feel right to you emotionally. The Thalmor believe in their superiority so strongly that they've constructed elaborate theological and philosophical justifications for it. But intelligence combined with rigid ideology often leads to disaster because smart people are exceptionally good at defending ideas that should be questioned. There's also something here about the cycle of oppression and how it perpetuates itself. The Altmer were oppressed, so they oppressed others. Those others will likely want revenge if they ever get power, leading to more oppression. How does that cycle end? Not through more oppression, clearly. Probably through some kind of acknowledgement where people recognize harm done and commit to doing better. But that requires both sides to give up the satisfaction of revenge and the comfort of viewing themselves as purely victims or purely righteous. It requires admitting complexity and embracing uncertainty. The Thalmor can't do that because their entire identity is built on certainty and superiority. And that's why they're probably doomed. Not because they're weak, but because they're psychologically incapable of the flexibility that would let them adapt and survive. Finally, the Thalmor are interesting because they force us to think about questions that don't have easy answers within the context of Elder Scrolls lore. When is violent resistance to oppression justified in Tamriel? What do you do when your enemy has legitimate grievances? How do you oppose people who genuinely believe they're serving divine justice? What's the line between maintaining cultural identity and supremacist ideology? When does seeking justice become seeking revenge? These are questions that matter throughout the history of Tamriel. The conflicts between races, the rise and fall of empires, the clashes between different religious beliefs, these themes run through the entire Elder Scrolls series. The Thalmor are one expression of these eternal questions, and that's why Elder Scrolls lore is worth this kind of deep analysis. It's not just world building for its own sake, it's using fantasy to explore questions about power, ideology, revenge, and how societies justify terrible things to themselves. The Thalmor are a complete, fully realized faction with internal logic and consistent motivations. The Thalmor are wrong. I want to be clear about that after all this discussion. They're wrong about supremacy, wrong about their methods, probably wrong about the towers, and definitely wrong if they think destroying the world is going to solve anything. But they're wrong in interesting ways that make them worth studying. They're wrong in ways that teach us about how factions evolve within the Elder Scrolls universe, how grievances transform into extremism, how ideology can drive entire civilizations, and how the cycle of oppression perpetuates itself across the eras of Tamrielic history. They make us think about morality, justice, and power within the context of this rich fictional world. And ultimately, that's what good antagonists should do. They should challenge us, make us think, force us to articulate why we oppose them. The Thalmor do that brilliantly. They're fascinating villains precisely because understanding them requires engaging with difficult questions that don't have easy answers. So after all this, were the Thalmor right? No. But they're right enough to be interesting, wrong enough to be opposed, and complex enough to be worth understanding. And that's exactly what makes them such memorable and effective antagonists in one of gaming's richest and most complex fictional universes. Remember where we started, with that creation myth, with Lorkhan's deception and the spirits trapped in mortality. Everything that came after flows from that wound. The historical defeats, the rise to power through crisis, the ethnic cleansing, the Great War, the manipulation of Ulfric, the Tower Theory. It all traces back to that original belief that existence itself is wrong. The Thalmor aren't just a political faction, they're the living embodiment of a cosmic grudge that's thousands of years old. They're what happens when legitimate pain festers so long it becomes poisonous, when the memory of divinity curdles into the justification for genocide. Thanks for staying with me through what turned into basically an entire college course on Thalmor studies. I hope this gave you new ways to think about them, new appreciation for Elder Scrolls lore, and new understanding of one of the most complex factions in the series. The Thalmor are a fully realized antagonist force that rewards deep analysis. They make you think while they threaten, they challenge assumptions, and they force you to grapple with uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and power. May your roads lead you to warm sands, and may you never run into a Justiciar patrol. Bye.